James Hoffa served as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters president from 1958 to 1971. The Teamsters was originally known as a labor union for drivers. At age 18, Hoffa succeeded in getting dock workers better pay by organizing a strike. He began organizing for the Teamsters a year later and gradually rose through the ranks. Hoffa's influence as president of the Teamsters in the U.S. was significant. At the time, 90% of U.S. transportation was controlled by the Teamsters, who were controlled by Hoffa. In 1941, Hoffa and the Teamsters were engaged in a turf battle with rivals in Detroit. It's here, according to author and reporter Dan Mulde, that Hoffa got involved with the mob. Hoffa hired the mob to get rid of these rivals in the city, and although this worked, after this, the mafia essentially owned Hoffa.
Welcome to an all-new season of the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. This season, we dive into the most horrific unsolved murders in history. From the Black Dahlia murder to the unsolved murder of the Lady of the Dunes. Join us every Tuesday on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. As always, we thank you for listening.
Welcome to an all-new episode of the Cold Case Files from True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. I'm your host, Larry Leese. Today we're diving in to the unsolved murder of Jimmy Hoffa. But first, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Poddex, for sponsoring this episode. Visit poddex.com and use the promo code TCNS for 10% off your first purchase. James Hoffa served as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters president from 1958 to 1971. The Teamsters was originally known as a labor union for drivers. At age 18, Hoffa succeeded in getting dock workers better pay by organizing a strike. He began organizing for the Teamsters a year later and gradually rose through the ranks. Hoffa's influence as president of the Teamsters in the U.S. was significant. At the time, 90% of U.S. transportation was controlled by the Teamsters, who were controlled by Hoffa. In 1941, Hoffa and the Teamsters were engaged in a turf battle with rivals in Detroit. It's here, according to author and reporter Dan Mulde, that Hoffa got involved with the mob. Hoffa hired the mob to get rid of these rivals in the city, and although this worked, after this, the mafia essentially owned Hoffa. The mob and Hoffa formed a symbiotic relationship. The mob was able to benefit from taking loans out of the Teamsters pension fund, funneling these funds into the financing of many Las Vegas casinos. Hoffa and the Teamsters, in turn, got a favorable return on these loans. Despite Hoffa's connections to the mob, he was beloved by union workers, as he was known for increasing benefits and wages for workers. Hoffa had a stable relationship with the mob in the 1940s and 1950s. But this began to splinter after he went to prison. Hoffa started serving a 13-year sentence behind bars in 1967 for crimes including bribery, jury tampering, and mail fraud. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon pardoned Hoffa with the promise that Hoffa would abstain from any union involvement until 1980. This pardon would oddly set into motion events that would lead to Hoffa's downfall. 4 years later, in early July, federal investigators found that the Teamsters' largest pension fund had been robbed of hundreds of millions of dollars. And only 2 weeks later, Hoffa vanished. The timing of these two occurrences seemed to suggest more than a coincidence. With the discovery of hundreds of millions of dollars gone missing from the Teamsters' pension fund and Hoffa barred from the Teamsters and free from jail, it stands to reason that Hoffa could have made it known to investigators that the mafia was involved with the Teamsters' pension funds. On July 30th, 1975, 62-year-old Hoffa was seen outside a Detroit area restaurant called the Match's Red Fox. According to notes written by Hoffa to his family, Hoffa was asked to meet two acquaintances at 2 p.m. at this restaurant. The acquaintances were suspects Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, both members of the mafia. Provenzano was also a Teamster. However, neither of them showed up to the meeting, and they both insisted that there had been no meeting organized when questioned by the FBI. The two technically had alibis for the day of Hoffa's disappearance. Giacalone was at the Southfield Athletic Club, noticeably chatting up people he knew and didn't know. Investigators suspected this behavior as Giacalone was trying to solidify an alibi. Provenzano was in New Jersey, not Michigan, with his brother, Salvatore Provenzano, all afternoon playing cards in a union hall. After the two didn't show, Hoffa called his wife, Josephine, around 2:30 p.m. from a nearby hardware store payphone to tell her what had happened. There were 5 witnesses who told investigators that they saw Hoffa in the restaurant parking lot, looking like he was waiting for someone that afternoon. As Hoffa was fairly famous and recognizable at the time, additional witnesses said that a burgundy Mercury Marquis with 3 men inside picked up Hoffa in the parking lot. It stands to reason that Hoffa entering the car was the last time he was seen alive. The following morning, on July 31st, 1975, Hoffa's car was found in the restaurant parking lot. Witness statements that Hoffa entered a burgundy Mercury Marquis with 3 men seems to be corroborated by DNA evidence from years later. A hair found in the car was confirmed to belong to Hoffa. Therefore, it's possible, if not likely, that this is the car that transported Hoffa to the secondary location where he was killed. Witnesses stated that the driver of the car looked to be a man named Charles Chucky O'Brien, who was known to be like a surrogate son and protege to Hoffa. The thing to look at, Hoffa probably would not put himself into a car or into a dangerous situation unless there were people in the car that he trusted. O'Brien always denied that Hoffa entered the car and any involvement with Hoffa's disappearance. However, O'Brien was scrutinized by investigators after Hoffa's disappearance, with some maintaining that O'Brien's relationship with Hoffa had suffered after O'Brien felt that Hoffa should have gotten him better positions in the Teamsters. Hoffa's daughter has said that O'Brien, quote, was driving the car my father disappeared in the vicinity of the Red Fox, and reasoned that if my dad's hair was in the car, he was there. Investigators also noticed the car was recently cleaned. O'Brien said he was using the car to run errands, like transporting a 40-pound package of salmon from Detroit to a union official's house. He said that the salmon had spilled blood in the back seat, so he needed to get it cleaned. German Shepherds also found Hoffa's scent in both the back seat and the trunk. Hoffa's son had said when he asked O'Brien if he was involved in his father's disappearance, O'Brien quickly fled the room. Searches for Hoffa included both literal and searches through phone and other records, but unfortunately, Hoffa's body was never found. One thing seems to be generally agreed upon, that Hoffa, in some way, was killed by the Mafia. The Hoffex Memo, a document written in January 1976 by federal investigators, indicates that authorities suspected that the Mafia, concerned that Hoffa would make it known they had infiltrated the Teamsters and accessed its pension fund to pay for its illegal operations, decided to kill him. As for the question of why Hoffa would divulge information to investigators, one book on the case, I Heard You Paint Houses, suggests that the Mafia was concerned that Hoffa, who was anxious to get back into union leadership, would be willing to swap information with the authorities to lift his 1980 restriction on union activity that Nixon ordered. Hoffa was also apparently vocal about trying to get the mob out of the union and the union's pension fund. Even still, despite knowing that someone in the mob likely killed Hoffa, investigators could never figure out who it actually was. 4 months into the investigation, Ralph Picardo, an inmate in New Jersey, claimed that he had information obtained while one of Hoffa's killers visited him in prison. Picardo's information allowed the investigators to form their list of suspects, most of which were connected to Provenzano, one of the men that Hoffa was supposed to meet the day he disappeared. However, all the suspects took the fifth and didn't testify, which dashed any hope of an indictment and led to an essential cold case. Thanks for listening to this episode of True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. Give us your theories on what you think happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Is he still alive? Let us know on Twitter at TrueCrimeNS. And please subscribe and rate and review this podcast. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. Follow us on Twitter at TrueCrimeNS. Like us on Facebook at True Crime Never Sleeps. Send us a voice message at anchor.fm/True Crime Never Sleeps /message. Tune in next week for an all-new episode.